I'm going to do a shorter presentation this morning to give us a little bit more time to discuss the issue here. Because obviously socialism, whenever you talk about politics, it can get quite interesting. So I have some folks coming right in here. Find a spot close up. So in case you want to comment, during the Q&A, I'm going to move my computer closer to you. Also, our audience on Zoom can hear when you all make a comment. So, but yeah, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's a few minutes after. So, what's that? Well, socialism is a very light topic. People don't really have opinions about it. So hopefully I will keep you all engaged. So, but let's get started. I do want to remind everybody that I will be discussing capitalism next week. Okay. So and then after that, I'm going to offer a third alternative. And I really would like some input from you all to hear your opinions. I'm very curious to see what people think about these ideas: capitalism, socialism, and the other alternative I'll present in the third week. Very curious. But anyway, let's get started here. Many artists of the 20th century were members of the Communist Party, such as Diego Rivera, who painted this image of peasants hard at work. And if they weren't communists, at least they were sympathetic to socialist ideas and values that communism was based on. Well, now my slide doesn't want to move forward. Let me escape. There we go. Many artists have long felt a close sympathy for common laborers because, frankly, a lot of artists can relate to common struggling laborers. You see, the artists create all day long, and they often receive little material reward for their labor. But artists do experience a spiritual reward through their creative work. The works of Jean-Francois Millet, in particular, express a natural sympathy for workers. Millet's works lend a dignity to common laborers who must eke out an existence. Now, Van Gogh, too, felt not only this sympathy, but he actually felt real empathy for struggling laborers because he himself struggled. Despite his prodigious output, I think he painted over 1,000 works, he struggled all of his life just to survive. So he had real empathy for the common laborer. And then artists such as Gustave Courbet, however, were not interested in dignifying the common laborer like our previous two artists, but expressing the harsh reality of their daily existence. This work that you're looking at here, The Stone Breakers, was completed 1 year after Marx and Engels published their Communist Manifesto. And it depicts common laborers whose clothes are tattered. Can you make out their clothes and how shabby they are? And look at the kind of work they're doing and the setting. Nothing is really glorified here. Work is not honored or presented in an honorable way, so to speak. The painting seems more like it's intended to shock us into empathy for the plight of many workers. So that's one reason for socialism's appeal for artists. They have a natural affinity for the common worker. They understand the struggles of eking out an existence. But to better understand socialism's appeal and its Marxist variant, let's look at socialism's history. And first, I'll offer a definition to make sure that we're all clear about what we mean. Socialism, defined in Oxford's languages, is a political and economic theory, a social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Now, when we say the community owned, then we really mean the state as representative of the people. And a good example of this is close by us, Cuba. Marxism is actually a broader term which interprets history from a materialist and economic point of view. But since it advocates socialism as its best economic model, many use socialism and Marxism interchangeably, and I'm probably going to do the same today, okay? So I hope that will not cause any confusion. Now, Marxists believe capitalism is based on an exploitive relationship between the worker and the capitalist, and the capitalist is the owner or whatever enterprise employs the worker. Marxists also believe capitalism ultimately erodes democracy by putting power in the hands of a few who then use their wealth to inordinately influence the government to create policies in their interests. Now, I want to point this out. Socialism did not originate with Karl Marx. We see it a generation earlier in the works of French intellectuals like a philosopher, Etienne Cabet, who founded a socialist utopian society that actually made its way to the United States in 1848, lasted until about the 1890s. And then Robert Owen, whom you see next to Cabet, owned a textile manufacturing business in England. He owned it, yet reformed his factory under socialist principles. He led the development of the trade union movement and free coeducational schools. And so an entrepreneur, friends, can be a socialist. But even before Owen and Cabet, social movements were present during the English Civil War during the 17th century. And listen to this. These socialist movements were made up of Christian dissidents. Now, does it surprise you that Christian groups espoused socialism well before Karl Marx? Where did these Christians get their ideas about socialism? From the Bible, of course. From the book of Acts, chapter 2, we have this verse. And all the believers were together and had all things in common, and they would sell their property and possessions and share them with all, to the extent that anyone had need. And then this verse from 1 Corinthians reads, the one who plants and the one who waters have a common purpose, and each will receive wages according to the labor of each. So in capitalism, the argument goes the worker is not rewarded according to their labor in capitalism. Their labor is owned by the capitalist who owns the business where they work. And a disproportionate amount of the reward for their labor goes to the capitalist or owner or executives, shareholders. So an exploitive relationship between laborers and business owners naturally develops. And this is why Jewish and Christian scriptures speak often against any rich person who would take advantage of the vulnerable. This is from the Hebrew scriptures, oppressing the poor in order to enrich oneself and giving to the rich will lead only to loss. Let me read that again. Oppressing the poor in order to enrich oneself and giving to the rich will lead only to loss. Is that true? I mean, perhaps it will lead to spiritual loss, but I think we're all aware that some people have been exploited for financial gain, and that it was a positive for the person who did the exploiting. But what this proverb is really doing is it's expressing an ideal about the relationship between the poor and the wealthy. That is all throughout the Christian and Hebrew scriptures. And here is the clincher. From Acts chapter 4, now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. So folks, the roots of socialism can justifiably be seen in Christian teaching. But we know socialism today with the Christian aspects removed. And that's mainly because of Karl Marx and his co-writer Friedrich Engels, who expressed the moral vision of socialism in their pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto. This is a first edition in German you see here. They expressed their moral vision, but stripped it of its religious and spiritual moorings. Why did they do that? Well, for one thing, they believed capitalists exploited the religious idea that salvation was something that you experienced in the hereafter, when you died. Your reward for struggle on earth was heaven. Marx expressed a secular materialist philosophy instead. A worker should not have to wait for rewards once they died. They should have rewards for their labors in the here and now. And the only way that is possible is if they received the full fruits of their labor rather than the capitalist who claims an inordinate share of the profit from the labor of the workers. Now, no surprise, these ideas became popular among workers, intellectuals, and artists. But before we move on to examples of artists, I'd like to share with you this quote. I am convinced there is only one way to eliminate those grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion. A planned economy which adjusts production to the needs of the community would distribute the work to be done among all those able to work and would guarantee a livelihood to every man, woman, and child. The education of the individual, in addition to promoting his own innate abilities, would attempt to develop in him a sense of responsibility for his fellow men in place of the glorification of power and success in our present society. This quote comes from an article titled "Why Socialism?" written by this man, Albert Einstein. So Marxist or socialist ideas were quite prevalent among progressive thinkers and creatives across many disciplines in the 20th century because they have moral strength in them, even moral beauty. And in theory, at least, socialism seems like a logical solution to inequality in the distribution of resources in capitalist societies. So artists were initially drawn to these ideas out of a sense of affinity and empathy with laborers because they too were laborers, but socialism also possesses a strong moral appeal, equality and human dignity, which derive from Christian teaching and practice. So many artists felt a greater affinity with the common folk than with the capitalists who treated their art like a commodity. And the idealistic vision of equality and personal dignity also appealed to artists who knew what it was like to suffer in poverty in order to create their art. And so many of them felt naturally at home in the Communist Party. Mexican muralist Diego Rivera painted numerous works depicting the plight of the worker, the inequality, and also the dignity of the worker as well. In this mural, amidst many laborers working hard on a sugar plantation, we have a foreman on horseback, and he's kind of holding some kind of rod or stick that has a point at the end, kind of menacingly. And in the background, I don't know if you can see it, way in the background, above those two dogs sleeping, we have a pale, wealthy landowner relaxing in a hammock while all of these laborers profit him and make him rich. Rivera depicts here Karl Marx calling workers to unite in solidarity, to claim their right to more of the fruit of their labors. And here's another work calling all laborers to unite. Now look at this mural for a second. Notice the imagery. It's very religious. The call to embrace socialist society is a religious one in these artists, in their hearts and minds. Diego Rivera's off and on again wife, Frida Kahlo, was even more passionate about Marxism, and Rivera depicts her in this work as the central figure in Marxist revolution. Now, Frida Kahlo grew up in a political upheaval and bloody revolutions when in 1910, the peasant classes revolted. And there were calls for land reforms and the nationalization of resources. I'll give you a second to look at this before I move on. The rebels in many of these works, including the artist herself, Frida Kahlo, also rejected the influence of European styles and values and sought to promote indigenous Mexican culture. As a woman who suffered in a male-dominant world, Frida identified with those who were marginalized. So Frida identified closely with the struggle to be free. And she knew intimately the struggle to overcome immense emotional and physical pain. Many of you who've been with me a while remember my presentations on Frida Kahlo and understand very deeply how much she suffered in her life. And so because of all these struggles and the affinity she had with the laborers, she identified freedom with the ideals of Marxism. Now, I've said this before a lot. One of the common practices of artists, and one of the most valuable, in my opinion, is to challenge prevailing paradigms, usually the dominant one. And what is the dominant prevailing paradigm in the West? It's capitalism. And the most captivating challenge to capitalism during this time for many artists of the 20th century was socialism or Marxism. And then finally, there is the peculiar case of Pablo Picasso. After Stalin's purges in the late 1930s, many artists and writers began to abandon communism, though they still held a lot of sympathy for socialist ideals and values. But Picasso not only supported communism, he actually joined the party. Why would he do that? Guernica, Picasso's most famous work, was a cry to the world after General Francisco Franco asked the Nazis to bomb the symbolic and historic Basque town of Guernica. Franco was a fascist. He led a military insurrection against the freely elected Republican government, which was in alliance with communist parties. During the 1930s and 40s, liberation movements, especially against fascism, had a Marxist spirit to them. Picasso and other artists were anti-fascist, and so they naturally found a home in Marxist circles. Picasso won the Stalin Prize for this dove, which was used for a poster of peace. Here is the poster of peace on the left, and next to it is an official statement Picasso made after he officially joined the Communist Party. Allow me to read to you or quote a portion of that confession by Picasso. I have become a communist because our party strives more than any other to know and to build the world, to make men clearer thinkers, more free and more happy. I have become a communist because the communists are the bravest in France, in the Soviet Union, as they are in my own country, Spain. While I wait for the time when Spain can take me back again, the French Communist Party is a fatherland to me. We must remember that it was the Soviet Union, it was the communists in Spain, and it was the communists in Italy, frankly, and the communists in France who fought against all forms of fascism during World War II. And here's another quote from another source where Picasso states, "Have not the communists been the bravest in France and the Soviet Union and in my own Spain? How could I have hesitated? The fear to commit myself? But on the contrary, I have never felt freer, never felt more complete. And then I have been so impatient to find a country again. I have always been in exile. Now I am no longer one. Whilst waiting for Spain to be able to welcome me back, the French Communist Party have opened their arms to me, and I have found there all whom I respect most. The greatest thinkers, the greatest poets, and all the faces of the resistance fighters in Paris, whom I saw and were so beautiful during those August days. Again, I am among my brothers." That quote, I believe, is from the late 40s or early 50s. And so Picasso, like many artists, were socialists or communists because they were influenced by the circumstances of history, by their cultural and geographic location, when fascism threatened the world. And when capitalist countries like the United States threatened democratically elected communist regimes. And there's always the moral appeal of socialism. Instead of asking what makes us money, what gives us power, socialists during the 20th century were asking what makes us human and what unites us as humans. Now, these are all idealistic questions, revealing a desire to make life the way it should be rather than as it is. And such ideals appeal to many 20th century artists who saw the prevailing capitalist system making us less human and more like commodities or servants. But of course, history teaches us that many attempts at utopias have often ended up as dystopias. Some thinkers believe communism failed in Russia and Eastern Europe and other places because it was a moral vision stripped of its religious and spiritual basis. And hence, we have the existence of the many Christian socialist parties around the world. Here is their symbol. It's a modification of the sickle and hammer with the cross inserted. So let me ask you, can socialism work better if redeemed by the faith that inspired it? Pope Benedict XVI attacked Karl Marx in an encyclical, but not necessarily socialism, stating that with the victory of the revolution, though Marx's fundamental error also became evident. He showed precisely how to overthrow the existing order, which needed to be overthrown, but he did not say how matters should proceed thereafter. He forgot that freedom always remains also freedom for evil. He thought that once the economy had been put right, everything would automatically be put right. His real error is materialism. Man, in fact, is not merely the product of economic conditions, and it is not possible to redeem him purely from the outside by creating a favorable economic environment. So what do you think? Why would any artist or any other person still find socialism attractive when history has so many examples of its failures? And can socialism be redeemed, as the Christian socialists claim?